Morning to everyone and good afternoon to our American colleagues. Welcome to our webinar for today, which is on internet gaming risk community. It's an expert panel discussion with Dr. Charlotte Beard and Dr. Michelle Carras. It's being hosted by the Cyberpsychology Research Group from the Institute for Health and Sport. So why is Victoria University interested in this topic? Melbourne is the hub of over 30% of the Australian gaming production studios, and Victoria, the state which we are in, has 53% of gaming production studios. The western suburbs of Melbourne has been shown to suffer a disproportionate share of losses related to gambling, and there are similarities between disordered gaming and gambling. So I'll be giving you a brief overview of the structure of today's presentation. We'll have introduction to our panelists by our PhD candidates, Qasim Latifi and Daniel Zarati. Dr. Basilius Stavropoulos will present an overview of the topic area. We will have our expert panel discussion. There are three main areas that will be covered: diagnostic challenges and balancing potential benefits and harms, the quality of available evidence, and finally, do we need policies to address potential harm from internet gambling? It'll be followed by a question and answer session and a closing by that. I'll stop sharing.
Okay. I can't. Welcome everyone to the panel. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you one of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Charlotte Beard. So Dr. Charlotte Beard specializes in the intersection between mental health and technology. She's received her PhD from Palo Alto University and further training from the University of California, San Francisco, and the University of Texas Health Science Center. Her research is focused on gaming disorder as an emerging mental health concern, and her aim is to create interventions and wellness initiatives that are developed for a community of gamers, including partnerships with esports. Some of her notable publications include research on the relationship between self-esteem and internet gaming disorder, including the development of the gaming contingent self-worth scale as a predictor of internet gaming disorder symptoms. Dr. Beard has published over 20 peer-reviewed papers related to digital mental health in prominent journals of the field, such as Computers in Human Behavior, the International Journal of Mental Health and Addiction, and Cyberpsychology, Behavior, and Social Networking. She has been an invited speaker for gaming disorder and the role of technology in mental health. Dr. Beard is also involved in mental health startups, including Open World Health and organizations she is building. She serves as the development director for Therapists in Tech, an organization aimed at involving clinicians' voices in digital mental health. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Victoria University and Vas and Qasim for that very nice introduction.
Welcome, Charlotte. Very nice having you here. Very nice.
All right, it's my turn to introduce Michelle Carras. So I'll share my screen if I am allowed. I think I'm not allowed to share my screen.
And I can share the screen for you. Yeah?
Would you mind, Vas? Yeah, thank you.
I think we can say it.
All right. I would like to thank Dr. Vasileios Stavropoulos for inviting me to participate in this event. In this occasion, I have the honor to introduce Dr. Michelle Carras. Dr. Carras is a public mental health researcher from John Hopkins University, and also a member of the American Association for Suicidology, Technology, and Innovation Committee. She has published more than 30 articles in academic journals covering important topics in the area of public health, psychopathology, psychiatry, epidemiology, and e-health. Dr. Carras has been studying the role of commercial video games in mental health for more than 5 years and has spoken at international academic conferences, gaming conventions, and her work has been covered by multiple news outlets. She received an honorarium to speak at the Johns Hopkins Department of Psychiatry about video games and mental health, and has addressed this topic in other unpaid conferences and lectures. It is important to denote that Dr. Carras has no past or current financial relationships with any organization related to the video game industry. Dr. Carras loves to talk about the intersection between scientific evidence and public health, particularly in relation to gaming disorder and problematic gaming. She addresses this topic in a way that protects potential vulnerable communities and promotes a healthy population. Dr. Carras believes that video games and social media have the potential to be useful platforms for delivering public health interventions. And more importantly, during an interview in 2016, she recommended against adding gaming disorder to the WHO Diagnostic Handbook because she argues that there is no consensus in terms of assessment of symptoms, and most studies in the area are of a low quality. Please welcome Dr. Michelle Carras.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is such a cool opportunity, and I'm really glad that you invited me.
Welcome, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Daniel, for introducing Michelle. Now, it's my turn to introduce the topic and why we are here to discuss about controversies, risks, and opportunities around internet gaming. So I'm going to introduce some controversies in relation to digital gaming. My name is Vasilios. I've been collaborating with both Michelle and Charlotte and Romana in the teaching field, and Kasim and Daniel are my students. And I'm really grateful that all of them are here today. So digital gaming, a tale of two ends. A little information about the situation in our city and in our country. So the digital gaming market is a growing economic market for Australia, at least till 2018. Then it softened for about 10% in 2019, and it continues growth since then, estimated at over 3.5 billion. The market had a 25% revenue rise just in 1 year. Subscription revenue exclusively also continues to boom, experiencing 28% growth in just 2019. The Interactive Games and Entertainment Association estimates that over 70% of Australians have been gaming in some form of frequency. The local gaming production industry, as Romana said, 30% Melbourne-based, is export-orientated, with 83% of the industry's income being generated overseas. These appear to have been driving demand for over 30 relevant Australian degrees. Video games appear to play an important role in family, with 43% of Australian parents reporting playing online games with their children. Video games for health. Older Australians cite the role of the role that video games play in positive aging, with 87% of those questioned reporting using games as a tool for mental stimulation. Video games continue to educate. Half of the Australian parents surveyed in 2020 Digital Australia report indicated that their children use video games for educational purposes in school, and 53% of them believe that games can provide their children with greater confidence. However, excessive or disordered gaming may be detrimental for a proportion of mainly younger gamers who experience depression, anxiety, and productivity loss. Thus, in 2013, the American Psychiatric Association introduced internet gaming disorder as a diagnosis requiring attention in the fifth edition of the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. Similarly, in 2019, the World Health Organization also formally included gaming disorder in the International Classification of Diseases. There's an estimated 4.6% global prevalence of adolescent gaming disorder, according to a meta-analysis published in 2018. Literature implies that as newer generations are more digitally skilled, population ages and game accessibility increases through portable devices and smartphones, future prevalence will also spike across older ages, or may also spike across older ages. This is important due to the multiplied cost of the disorder for gamers and their families. Relationship and well-being issues such as reduced sleep, physical activity, depression, and anxiety are only some of the negative symptoms related to internet gaming disorder. So the question that we hope that we'll have the opportunity to address here is, how can we maintain the benefits whilst reducing the risks related to the expansion of internet games? We hope that our panelists, Michelle and Charlotte, will help us address this question in a balanced and informative way. And we are very glad that they are here with us today. Thank you. Thank you. So Romana, would you like to name the sections we are going to go through?
Okay, so the first section is the diagnostic challenges and balancing the potential benefits and harms. Who would like to start?
Is it all right if I start?
Of course.
Okay, great. First, I just wanted to give an additional disclaimer and tell everyone a little bit about my story, because I feel like that reflexive element is important for understanding where researchers come from. So first, I am a researcher, but I got into this because I'm also a gamer. And many years ago, I was playing a lot of World of Warcraft, several days a week, long raids. And I found myself thinking that perhaps I had some kind of a problem. But at the same time, I was also connecting socially. It was helping with my depression. And I saw the same kind of effects in my son, who has autism. So now I still consider myself a gamer. I don't game very much. I spend a lot of time doing cycling training in a virtual world, though, so I'm still pretty close. And my research combines my backgrounds in mental health advocacy, population science, parts of public health. And it's all been funded by the US government sources. So I'm pretty happy with what's been going on with my research. But I have to say that when it comes to the diagnosis of internet gaming disorder and of gaming disorder, I feel like there's an element of epistemic capture that's going on that makes it a little challenging to get a full picture. And I think it's kind of hindering our consensus about exactly what we're talking about and what we should be measuring. So if you don't mind, I'll share a little bit of the history of internet gaming disorder diagnosis, because it's fascinating to me. When we started talking about tech addictions for inclusion in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is a list of, well, how we learned about it in psychiatric epidemiology was that it was a field guide. It's not meant to describe causes of pathology. It's just meant to be a way of talking about things so that people can understand one another. So the early working groups were considering a much broader internet addiction or internet use disorder diagnosis. And they weren't sure if it should be considered more of an addiction or an impulse control disorder or something similar. So what happened was very interesting. The working group had documents up for comment on the internet. And in November of 2012, they said, okay, the comment period is over. And they took all the documents off, they took the comments off. And that was the time that I submitted a grant to study internet use disorder. And by the time the grant was scored, the DSM had come out with internet gaming disorder. So I lost a grant because one reviewer said, the disorder is called internet gaming disorder and your thing is referring to internet use disorder. So I bring it up because it shows the level of back and forth, the level of conflation, and the other challenges that we have with understanding this concept and differentiating between tech addictions. So now we have internet gaming disorder with its criteria. We have gaming disorder, which is from the World Health Organization. And I don't know, I would probably say thousands of studies of different instruments to measure these two things. So I'll stop there and let Charlotte talk.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I want to address something you said that's really important. There's this beautiful, elegant quote by, I think, Kim and Kim 2012 that says, people are no more addicted to the internet than alcoholics are to bottles. So basically they're saying the content of what's inside is what's reinforcing and might get people hooked. I think the diagnostic challenges come in three sort of spheres. The first one is public. There's this idea of like, well, my kid's addicted to their iPad, right? This is just something that's in our vernacular that we talk about. And there's a public misunderstanding of what addiction is, formal addiction versus overuse and engagement. The second sphere is this scholarly debate, as you've talked about, Michelle, which is, if you read debate papers, they go back and forth with all these different ideas about, okay, we've got these criteria and these criteria, which are the best? How do they function across cultures and countries? And sometimes what we try to just focus on is you know, what's the core elements? But I want to sort of approach this in the third sphere, which is the clinical perspective. And to me, as a clinician, what we're always looking at is functional impairment. And so I find functional impairment to be sort of the thing that takes us out of the challenge and into sort of recognizing problematic gaming disorder or gaming addiction as a real thing that's occurring and affecting many lives. So in terms of the diagnostic challenges, I think we're getting there. I like the WHO criteria. What they did is they took what we knew about internet gaming disorder and they made it much more elegant and simple. They said there's three main things to look at: impaired control, increased priority, and then the continuation despite consequences. So diagnostically, if you're thinking about this as someone who's experiencing problematic gaming, it's, I want to stop, but I can't. Everything else has to come second. And this is ruining my life. And you can see how those things can apply to a very small subset of people who do play internet games, but have severe consequences for those who are experiencing this.
I think that's such a good point, the focus on the functional impairment. And that's one of the things that makes me think about why it might not be the best idea to focus on gaming, because the amount of people who play games, like Vas was talking about, implies that any functional impairment could affect a large population. But the functional impairment is not as clear for gaming as it is for other types of addictive disorders. So for example, And I use the term addiction very broadly because I'm not yet convinced that it satisfies the criteria of an addiction like Charlotte was talking about. So if you consider smartphone addiction, the impairment could be potentially fatal if someone can't put their phone down while they're driving. If you consider exercise addiction, a person who has an addiction to exercise for many years, they can suffer from bone loss, they can suffer from fractures related to the bone loss, and many other types of problems. So while from a clinical perspective, I imagine, not being a clinician, I should make that very clear, I would imagine you could see functional impairment in the office. We have the challenge that how can it be identified prior to people coming into clinical treatment so that we can figure out how to prevent it? And I wanted to talk about that in relation to these various consensus things that have come up, because we had a paper come out, I believe it was last week, that was an expert appraisal of criteria for internet gaming disorder and gaming disorder. And it used a multi-stakeholder approach. It used a very systematic approach called a Delphi process to bring together panels of experts to discuss what the potential criteria are related to these specific ones that are available, and asking experts to contribute other potential criteria. And I've done similar studies with very small samples of gamers at conventions. So I've gone to gaming conventions and I've said to, to potential gamers, if you're interested in attending a panel about game addiction, please come, we're gonna be doing some research, we'd love to have your input. And I've done that at 2 different conventions. And surprisingly, it turned out very well, because gamers are actually very interested in learning about game addiction and in talking about their experiences. So just really to sum it up, in doing this research and comparing these 2 expert groups, the clinician researchers and the gamers, surprisingly, they agreed across many of the criteria. There was high consensus for continued use, which is one of the ICD criteria, as well as DSM. They agreed across loss of control. They agreed that some things were not as important, like preoccupation with games. And they agreed that things like lying shouldn't even be considered a criteria. Now, one thing that I thought was really interesting that implies that it's very useful to talk to other stakeholders is that the gamers I spoke to didn't say losing an opportunity or failing out of school or work was a problem. They said the problem is if you start avoiding socializing, if you isolate yourself. So the interesting thing is that's at a lower level. So gamers are saying, no, the problem begins when we start isolating. And to me, that's fascinating, because the approaches that are being taken are focusing on experts. But in my research, I like to be inclusive, and I think that gamers represent an expert voice that needs to be brought more into the conversation.
That's a beautiful point. I agree with you. I agree with you. And I love hearing your perspective too, because as a clinician, I'm used to thinking about when people come to my office, sort of where they're at. But what you're talking about is the broader parts of prevention. And there's a big space in this, and then we're going to talk about this a little later. But I want to address something you said about the idea of gaming as an addiction or as an addictive process. Now, there's something that's different for gaming than some of the other things you mentioned, or other behavioral addictions or process addictions that people might think about. With gaming, there's this engineered reinforcement paradigm. And if we think about schedules of reinforcement, they range from something like you kill 3 enemies, you get a bag of coins, to you're wandering about and you can get some epic things. And these reinforcement paradigms are what keep us coming. And I think that's why a lot of this early research has come out of the gambling research, because it similarly activates parts in our brain that are so reinforcing. And so they've done these neuropsych studies. We're looking at the neurobiological underpinnings of gaming and how they map on to some of the neurobiological underpinnings of addiction. And so I do think that you know, we have our person here who might be a vulnerable individual. Maybe they have depression, anxiety, ADHD especially. And of course, I think one thing you mentioned that is underlooked at is ASD as well, autism spectrum disorder. You have these vulnerable individuals who are kind of engaging with a game. And on the other side, we imagine this team of engineers, and it's their job to keep them coming. And I think that's why it makes it a little bit different than exercise or shopping, shopping and marketing. But still, it's different because of that sort of built-in reinforcement that people get, that dopamine burst that they get that's so similar to addiction. Now, thinking about how we can put this in the realm of addiction. If we think about, for example, heroin and cocaine, they have very different effects. And they look very different when we're treating someone who has heroin use disorder versus cocaine use disorder. But at the end of the day, the function underneath, the neurobiological process is the same. And I think that's where gaming sort of comes into the fold as an addictive behavior. Now, there's another point you said, Michelle, I'd be remiss not to talk about, which is the necessity of hearing gamers' voices. I too, when I first saw gaming disorder in the DSM, I was outraged. I said, oh, this must be a stigma. This must be a stigma. People think, you're playing that game, you're so isolated, you know, that nothing's really going on. But it's such a rich and beautiful world. But, you know, the more I started studying it, the more I could hear people's stories of, I had that roommate in college who played, you know, World of Warcraft for 8 hours and dropped out, 8 hours a day and dropped out. And you hear these stories over and over again. And, you know, the question for me is how do we, you know, get these stories, hear the perspectives of gamers, and use that in order to make treatments and prevention initiatives that are palatable and don't have that stigma, and they demystify the addictive process that games might be operating under.
I agree that those things are really important. And I think the thing that confuses me, though, is that we don't have a good handle on the harms at a population level from gaming related addictive behaviors versus the things that are more clearly measurable, like texting and driving, or you know, death from exercise addiction as a part of anorexia nervosa. So that's where, as a population scientist, it really makes me want to question the focus on gaming. Not that gaming isn't a problem and people with gaming disorder don't show up in clinics for treatment, but that, you know, perhaps in focusing so much on gaming disorder, we may be shining the light away from other things that are more clearly harmful at a population level. But, oh, I did want to also reply to the reinforcement criteria. First, that was one of the things that gamers in my samples brought up. They said that they feel like that's a part of addiction. They feel like that should be a criterion. If you can't avoid responding to those reinforcement schedules, then that should be considered a problem. And in my other study where I asked people, what could the industry do? That was also something they addressed. They said, you got to cut back on those things. So I think it's fascinating to bring those other voices in and make it clear that it's expected that the industry be responsible, and that that's not just coming from the WHO, and that's not just coming from public health researchers, it's coming from gamers themselves. And I know for myself, Duolingo is the only other game that I play regularly. And if Duo comes up on my tablet at night and he says, you haven't done your Dutch lesson today, I will stop everything and pick up my tablet and do my Dutch lesson so I don't lose my streak. So.
That's right, using it for good and for bad, right?
I think this first part of the conversation, considering the diagnostic challenges, can close here. But before it closes, I would like to ask both of you, how do you explain the emergence of self-help groups like Online Gamers Anonymous, people who self-refer, self-describe as if they are suffering from internet gaming disorder or this disorder, excessive usage of video games, And apparently for our country, for Australia, they meet every Sunday via Zoom in a self-help group. How do we explain that? And do we consider that as a voice that comes from within the gaming field, from outside? I would just like to hear your opinions.
I'd love to start on this one. Thanks, Bess. So we have Online Gamers Anonymous and a few other groups that have just been community-based. They've taken 12-step approaches and other approaches to helping each other and getting through problematic and addictive gaming. And I think your question asks is, how do we explain that? And I'm just going to use my stats from the US because that's what I know. But if we take a conservative prevalence estimate of 2%, and we've got 214 million gamers in the US, that's 4.2 million people who are at risk of gaming disorder. And if we think about what their treatment options are for gaming disorder, they're very low, right? And a part of that comes from lack of recognition, lack of funding, lack of corporate responsibility. We can go on and on, but regardless of the reason, what's happening is happening. So people are looking for support. They're craving support. They're needing help with this. So they're building it in their own communities. And I think that's sort of where this comes from. And yeah, it points to also a place where we really need more services.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. I also come from a background of peer support, and I study digital peer support. So I think this is a really wonderful opportunity for people to provide one another with that kind of support in a setting that they're very familiar with, because the anonymity that the internet fosters can really help people open up and confide. And knowing that other people in this group understand what they're going through, I think for many clinicians, it's really hard to get on board. I've found when we give presentations to clinicians about the potential therapeutic benefits of games, so many clinicians have told me, I don't even understand what the first thing of what you're talking about. So I know that there are pockets of like geek therapists who are gamers, who are also therapists and help people who have gaming related issues as well as other issues. But I would say outside of that, there may not be many clinical areas, whether formal centers or not, where people feel like they can really be understood with the nature of their problems.
That's a very, very interesting point. Very, very interesting point. Thank you so much for helping us to address this section, considering diagnostic controversies around the disorder. We're going to summarize your points at the end of this discussion. Romana, would you like to introduce the second section?
Okay, so the second section is looking at the quality of available evidence.
Who would like to start? So it's the quality of the available evidence. Within published literature, outside it, you are free to argue. Thank you.
Perhaps I could start and be brief this time, since I believe I started last time as well. I feel like the evidence could definitely be improved. The quality is variable. And because looking at tech addictions has been going on for a long time, there's been a lot of conflation between use of the internet and use of games, whether they're online or not. So in a review that my colleagues and I just came out with recently, we found that many systematic reviews of what was supposed to be gaming disorder associations with depression and anxiety, many of the studies contained in those reviews actually looked at internet use. They didn't look at games, or they looked at computer use. And that this didn't improve over the years consistently, but it seemed to vary a little bit more by where the research was coming from, or the type of research composition of the research team. So if we think about the conflation, that's one big issue. It's hard to say what's going on with gaming disorder when our studies are asking about internet addiction. The other thing is that there are various threats to the validity and the reliability of studies. And we find that often studies that are observational are making claims about causation, even though they are measuring things at the same time point. So these basic scientific methods in many cases are not clear. The methods aren't explained very well, and they do have these potential biases and threats to their validity. So we have standards for how things can be reported. We have standards for how we can reduce bias and talk about reducing bias. But outside of a few researchers, those things generally don't seem to be used.
Yeah, there's a lot of points I agree with you, Michelle, there. I try to think of this research. I know it's been many years now, but still is emerging. If we compare it to if we compare it to nicotine use disorder, for example, of course, internet gaming disorder is going to be a new body of research. And I think what we've built up to right now is looking at how we measure it. So that was sort of the first major thing to address, either with the criteria from the DSM or the WHO criteria. And now most people, it seems like, are shifting more to these more simple criteria and maybe using more than one measure. I was recently reading I think it was a meta-analysis or systematic review by Darvesh and colleagues. And I have some notes here. They said there's 35 different methods of evaluating internet gaming disorder with prevalence ratings between less than 1% to 57%. So I feel like that speaks for itself in terms of how much we know. But I want to give us credit for refining it. I think what we recognize is there's heterogeneity in how gaming disorder shows up across different cultures. We've been working very hard as gaming researchers and as a community of holding each other accountable for our claims and really figuring things out. And I think, as Daria Cussed called it in the past, chaos and confusion, I believe we're over that hump and into getting to something a little bit more specific here. What we need are RCTs, randomized controlled trials. Of course we do, right? Especially on the treatment side. But I think we also need funding. It's a little bit hard to find where we fit in the funding scheme as well. Are we NIMH? Are we drugs and alcohol? Where do we fall? And I've often gotten that sort of question. And that's another thing that I think is really important, that we do recognize this diagnosis, because if we want to have established treatments for something, I think we've got enough evidence to say that this is present. Now let's, put all our resources toward really refining what it is and fine tuning it as well. Because we need to.
I agree. My argument has always been that it is better to have a broader diagnosis, because the arguments for having funding and having something that healthcare systems would be willing to reimburse treatment for applies to other behavior disorders as well. Mm-hmm. So the person with exercise addiction, they may come in and not have a diagnosis. They may not have a treatment center. The same for smartphone addiction, buying addiction, those other things. So I feel like the argument could be made that those things should be treated the same. And again, because there are some other potential behavior addictions that have clearer public health impacts. That's why I've always supported the broader diagnosis. But I agree with you. We mentioned NIMH or NIDA. Those are the US funding bodies, government funding bodies for mental health funding, mental health research funding, and addictions research funding. And it's not clear. I'm glad that people are getting on board. And you talked about the neurobiology. Those things are always a good way to convince the funding bodies of the need for further research. So that's wonderful. I think the only other thing that I think would be great to see, because like I've said, I don't think the harms are as clear. It seems like there's a bit less clinical descriptions of people with gaming disorder that are really at kind of a basic level of what does this look like and what are some things that can be done. So I feel like there are some somewhat loose descriptions of treatment and descriptions of preventive interventions without a very clear picture of what the heterogeneity of people presenting for treatment looks like, or people whose parents are bringing them to treatment or whatever.
And I think, yeah, exactly. I think that's a limitation of our, at least the US. And if we look at South Korea and China, for example, and how they treat things, I mean, they're miles ahead. And I think they have distinguished a few subtypes of people with different types of gaming and recommended different CBT modular approaches based on what those people are presenting with. And yeah. So just wanted to mention that as well, to say there are some who are well ahead of us already.
Before we close this section and we pass to the next one, I'm tempted to ask a very spicy question that I was asked by the parent of one of my clients. He said, and I need to clarify my starting point here. So I started working as a clinician with substance abuse disorders, and at some point, a group of adolescent substance abusers somewhere in Greece, in the psychiatric hospital of Attica, where I started working with addictions, abstained from substances and started playing all together EverQuest back then in 2009. So we considered that as an addiction hopping behavior, jumping, replacing one form of addiction of another. And this is how my interest in the field started. Plus the fact that I've been a gamer myself, Age of Empires and a little bit of WoW, and I understand how this process can be very, very engaging and at the same time exciting and entertaining, but definitely very, very engaging for those of us who play. So the question that he asked, this man is, this parent, was, it seems here that as with other forms of addiction, there is a part of stakeholders who has been making profit out of it. The companies, he said, demonizing it. And then on the other side, because he was looking for a service for his son, and he couldn't find a service here in Australia, as Charlotte says. We have Medicare, we have private practitioners, psychologists who address it, but not in an organized way. We don't have groups, we don't have the infrastructure that European countries have in terms of public centers and RCT studies and stuff like that. So we started having this phenomenon of commercialization of treatment. And his question was, with this situation, do interests from both sides commercialize treatments, and internet gaming companies affect somehow the quality of the research or the evidence in the field? Sounds like a paranoid question, but it's a question existing in the evidence. I mean, you're academics, you are providing evidence, you are publishing studies. Conflict of interest not only from the side of the gaming companies, but from the other side too.
Well, I could speak to my own experience with that. I have, in public health, we do research that's directly related to health that is often focused on industry influence. And my positions in my research have been consistent with what the industry wants for a long time. And I was invited to speak to the WHO on behalf of the gaming industry, and I'm a gamer, but how we manage that conflict of interest is by being open about it. This is the kind of information that we put on our papers. And ideally, any paper talks about where its funding came from. So in a way, I personally haven't received any money from a gaming related organization. I know that's a thing with gambling disorder. But the other side of that is that there are clinical groups that are getting money to do clinical research and run clinics. So to me, it's this perverse incentive that we see in some healthcare systems, where there's a benefit to the provider to continue providing treatment. And that can be an unfortunate potential conflict of interest, but it's built into some, forms of reimbursement in healthcare systems.
Yeah, I think on that note, this is a very interesting question your patient asked us, and I kind of, it made me think, and I think that's good, right? I think what we need as people who study in this field are self-reflection and ethics. And we're all sort of walked through what those ethical conundrums are that we can get into. And of course, transparency and disclosure are very important. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this soon, but having said that, I think it's absolutely important to talk to the people who have control over this, right? We look at the ways we can impart policies, limiting availability, reducing risk and services to gamers, as sort of that was put out in an article recently. A lot of those are going to come from gaming companies and from other people taking corporate responsibility. But we sort of have to stand our ground to say, this is what we see. This is what the evidence says. This is the objective way of viewing things. And yeah, so I think it's going to be a constant checks and balances game. But as someone, I've recently taken a foray into the startup world here in Silicon Valley. And I think clinicians' voices, I think researchers' voices, I think public health voices are really important in the digital mental health revolution, because we've got a lot to offer and a lot to say. And if sometimes that means partnering with, other industries, I think if that's done carefully, that's important.
Good. Rom, I think we can close this section and we can go to the final one, which has to do with policies and responsibility, with the opportunity of Charlotte's comments. Rom,
Perhaps I can just keep going on that then, if you don't mind, Vasa.
Yes, please.
I've been recently thinking about this more in the realm of esports. So esports, as we know, especially with COVID, has just exploded in terms of popularity. When we think of esports, this might be these big competitions where people are playing League of Legends, and these gamers are just churning. The hours of practice is not a regulated sport like other sports are. They're unregulated, and oftentimes these people live together with their teams, and it's encouraged to keep playing all the time. And if the average gamer does 50 movements a minute on their controller, an esports gamer does 500. So we can see sort of the physical consequences, the social consequences that might be at play here. Now, it isn't to say that people who play esports are addicted to internet games. That's different. But looking at internet gaming as a whole, I don't think it's going anywhere. So what we need are mental health professionals. We need regulation. We need to be a part of this esports community as we begin to look at gamer mental health, the stresses, the burnout. And that goes to one more thing that I think we can't ignore in the gaming community, which is toxicity. People say what they want online. People oftentimes will provoke others. I can say oftentimes, very seldom, but it's scary when it happens, when people are provoked to kill themselves, to hurt themselves, when the SWAT team's coming to their house, all these types of toxic things that we've seen in this internet gaming space. Looking at Twitch and our female gamers, how sexualization over Twitch has been sort of encouraged, and I'm worried about that. I'm worried about a lot of these things that are happening in this space. While we see the benefits of community, we also see that it's the Wild West. And when it comes to policy, I think it's very important to get with lawmakers, one, and gaming companies too. Gaming companies to say, hey, do you have a social responsibility section yet? I think we should get that going. The social dilemma has really helped us along with that. And then policymakers to say, every sport's regulated, let's get this one regulated too, so we can protect the players and protect the community.
That's really cool. Esports is not something I'm really familiar with. as much as you are, obviously, and it's really cool to hear about it from a sports perspective. I also think about kind of basic prevention. So policy-wise, I think it would be good if we can focus on some ethical game development practices. So we had spoken about the reinforcement schedules. Loot boxes obviously are a huge topic of conversation right now. In my research, the loot boxes weren't even as important as things like exit points, appointment mechanics, and other simple ethical design elements that could be, if not promoted specifically through policy, at least could be part of an education intervention or labeling requirement or something like that. I also think in policy development, if we don't involve all of the stakeholders, we're going to potentially miss out on some of the things that should be targeted. So, for example, that idea of social isolation becoming more of a problem than getting to the point where you're dropping out of school. And you had mentioned, Charlotte, your point about toxicity is really important, but I think we have to keep in mind that that toxicity is part of the internet. And we saw it here in the US with the siege on our Capitol led through internet coordination. And that wasn't part of the online gaming community. That's just something that the internet can unfortunately foster. But it can also foster those connections and it can provide those social benefits. So especially within a game, Vas, you had mentioned your person who addiction hopped, but I think the thing that you could have brought out a little bit more is that they were hopping from something that can cause their body to physically deteriorate in a very clear way with serious health consequences to something that is perhaps less harmful. So we have this aspect, and I just completely lost my train of thought, and it's 2 p.m. and I have absolutely no excuse for that. Yes, we have a potential benefit of even an addiction level interaction with games being potentially less harmful and providing specific benefits if people aren't engaging in an unhealthy way. So providing those social benefits, providing some relief from the stresses of everyday life, some relief from, you know, depressive symptoms like rumination, for example. So yeah, so we didn't get a chance to talk too clearly about the harms and benefits, but I think these are some other things to keep in mind as we're trying to figure out policy and prevention going forward.
I think we have 5 minutes, Romana, before we close. I'm tempted to ask a little bit more about policies and in a kind of more balanced way. So policies in terms of protecting gamers from the risks of gaming. Do we need policies to protect the creativity related to games or the gaming industry, which apparently, according to the Australian government parliament discussion back in 2016, is a prosperous industry that needs to be reinforced and very promising in terms of exports? I'm just putting it out there as a question. And how do we find the fine line between responsible gaming, healthy or adaptive gaming, which is good for the community or the gamer, and reducing excessive gaming related harm and protecting the community at the same time? Any answers there?
I think there's so many great ideas. I don't have all of them, but if I think about the ESRB, that's the rating board that puts the rating on video games, saying this is violent or, you know, whatever. This has been very helpful, and gaming or gaming stores used to say, oh, if it doesn't have an ESRB rating, we're not going to sell it, and that was great, right? And I think in a paper that recently came out, one suggestion was to put an addiction rating on the games as well. Of course, there'd be a whole nother debate about how we rate that and how that comes up. And I'd love to be a part of that. But I think that's one thing we can do, right? To educate people. We also need to be in spaces with gamers and say, hey, gaming community, are we going to accept this, or are we going to change? To show people how a healthy leveling up looks like. Doesn't mean we have to go abstinence, right? but we can do harm reduction for people who might have problematic gaming. For parents say, my kid's playing this game, I can't relate to them, to get inside the game and play with them, teach them how to do games in a healthy way. Say, you lost it. That's harsh. It's okay next time. To really make it a part of our culture in a way. So it's a bit grassroots, is a bit from our culture. In terms of protecting gaming companies, I think that, I don't know too much about their financial structure, but I think they'll be fine. I think there's a lot of different organizations that have taken some social responsibility. And if we could have a voice in that, we'll back them up. It's just but that's the idea, not to treat them as adversaries, like to really be a part of it and say, we get you, and let's help with this one thing.
Oh, I think we can use our therapeutic lens of suspending judgment as we think about how can we help the game industry to understand how to self-regulate and improve the ethical design practices that will lead to healthy gaming.
Thank you both so much. It was really stimulating. Kasim and Daniel, do we have any questions in the chat? I think we have a comment. Would you like to read it? Or if there are any questions from the chat, please, you are welcome to submit them.
Yep, we've actually got one. I'll read it out. It reads, I often hear in the gaming community the argument, anything can be addictive, as a rebuttal to the World Health Organization's decisions to include gaming disorder. This does seem to hold some merit, especially considering that gaming disorder is literally gambling disorder verbatim, with the word gambling swapped out for gaming. With this line of argument, isn't anything in excess can technically be considered a disorder? Common examples frequently used include work, exercise, watching TV. You can pretty much substitute any behavior and it would make sense.
Yeah, any answers here? Would you like to make a comment here?
I absolutely agree. And I think that because we know that there are some serious public health harms related to other types of disorders, that our disorder should be more broad. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have gaming disorder. I'm saying gaming disorder should be one of many things that people might need clinical help to overcome.
Yeah, when it comes to these behavioral addictions, process addictions, I don't know that. I know exercise, of course, you get endorphins, so there must be something neurobiological going on there. But I think gaming is distinct. I think gaming is distinct because of the just powerful reinforcement paradigm that we see in gambling as well, right? It is designed to be compatible with drawing us in. The peanut butter, if I ate too much peanut butter, I would probably have a consequence. But I don't know if it would be a functional consequence. I wouldn't lose my friends, my job. I wouldn't be wearing diapers, so I didn't have to get up and stop eating peanut butter. And when people play excessive video games, these are the types of things that they do. So I think we have to look at the severity, the impact, and the design of something, and how it affects our brain and our behavior when we're considering it for a behavioral addiction. But like Michelle, I'm open to seeing a broader lens of process or behavioral addictions. But I think gaming is different than just putting anything there.
We may also be early in the process, because I think we have been focusing on gaming because we have this idea, we have some support from the neurobiology that it is like other addictions, but how much have we been really looking at exercise or smartphones or whatever? Maybe that's the area that needs to have a little more exploration.
I guess we are approaching at the end of this conversation. Romana, are we okay with time?
It's actually 7 o'clock.
So we need to close.
Yeah, some brief comments I've asked to close our webinar.
Yeah. I guess the fact that we could continue this conversation may indicate that we need to have another webinar, maybe some time ago, sometime later, and have more time to discuss, or maybe a more interactive webinar where the audience can participate in a more active way. Trying to sum up what we discussed today, it seems that both Charlotte and Michelle agree on the need of defining the fine line between excessive, disordered gaming and the benefits that healthy or adaptive gaming might have. A point that was raised several times by both of them was increasing the voices in the dialogue regarding the definition of what gaming disorder is, the risks and the benefits of gaming, and aiming to be more inclusive, not just academics, but also gamers, clinicians, the community. Another point that was highlighted in a very distinct and clear way was the need of specialized services where gamers can feel that they are understood. The appearance of self-helping groups like Online Gamers Anonymous was in a very clear way described, interpreted by Charlotte as a byproduct of this lack of services, despite the fact that there is demand. Michelle also highlighted the weaknesses in the literature in terms of definition or multi-definition, because we might assess something with various instruments which reflects on the prevalence rates that we have, which add ambiguity and lack of clarity in the field and how we should address that. But at the end of the day, what seems to come out of this discussion as the main point is the need of unity around gaming, its positive and negative effects, unity in the way we define it, and unity in the way we discuss about it, unity in the way we disagree about it, and we can bring different things all together on the table. Thank you so much for attending here, for attending our webinar. Those from Australia, you must have woken up very early. I hope you had your coffee. A nice day is ahead for us. Those from the US, you must be in the middle of the day or at the end of your day. Enjoy it. And those from Greece, you must also be quarantining at the end of your day somewhere in Athens. Enjoy that too. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to continue these discussions on another webinar. It's been a great pleasure having you all here.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Yes, very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. I guess yes, they are thanking us, I think. I'm going to send all of you a Zoom link so that we leave this webinar and meet for 5 minutes, okay?